Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The mountains of eastern Kentucky hold their secrets close, buried beneath layers of moss-covered stone and generations of silence. In the autumn of 1947, when the leaves turned the color of rust and dried blood, the small community of Harlan County whispered about Margaret Hale in the way people speak of shameful things, their voices dropping low when children entered the room. The Hale property sat 3 miles up a winding dirt road that carved through dense forest, where the morning fog clung to the hollers like wet wool and the creek water ran cold and clear over ancient rock. The house itself was built from local stone, a 2-story structure with narrow windows that seemed to watch the road with suspicious eyes, and a wraparound porch that sagged on the western side where rot had eaten through the support beams. Margaret had been a widow for 17 months when the first rumors began to surface, though the nature of her widowhood was itself a source of speculation. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had died in the winter of 1946 under circumstances that the county coroner ruled as accidental, a fall from the barn loft that broke his neck cleanly. Thomas had been 43 years old, a coal miner who worked the deep shafts near Lynch and came home every evening covered in black dust that Margaret would scrub from his clothes in a metal tub behind the house. They had married young, Margaret barely 16 and Thomas 19, in a small ceremony at the Baptist church in Harlan proper, and over the course of their marriage they had produced 7 children, though only 4 survived past infancy. The surviving children were Rebecca, age 23, who had married a man from Pike County and moved away, Samuel, age 19, who worked in the mines alongside his father until Thomas died, Dorothy, age 15, who helped her mother with the household duties, and little James, age 8, who attended the one-room schoolhouse down in the valley when the weather permitted. After Thomas died, Rebecca came back for the funeral but returned to her husband within a week, and Samuel found work in the Virginia coalfields, leaving only Dorothy and James under Margaret's care in the stone house that seemed to grow darker and more isolated with each passing season. Margaret Hale was 40 years old in the autumn of 1947, though the harsh Appalachian life had aged her beyond her years. Her face was lined deep around the mouth and eyes, and her hands were rough and calloused from decades of hard labor. She wore her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her dresses were simple cotton affairs, usually dark blue or black, with long sleeves even in summer. Her eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they carried an expression that neighbors described as cold, though some who knew her better might have called it exhausted. She rarely smiled, and when she spoke, her voice was flat and measured, as though she had long ago decided that words were precious commodities to be rationed carefully. The rumors began with small things, observations that accumulated like water behind a dam until the pressure became impossible to ignore. Dorothy stopped attending the occasional church socials that brought young people together, and when she did appear in town, usually for supplies at the general store, she moved with a stiffness that suggested pain or injury. She wore long sleeves regardless of the temperature, and her eyes had developed a haunted quality that made the store owner's wife uncomfortable. James, too, had changed. The boy who had once been eager and curious now seemed withdrawn, flinching at sudden movements and speaking only when directly addressed. He stopped attending school regularly, and when the truant officer made the long drive up to the Hale property to investigate, Margaret met him on the porch with a shotgun cradled in her arms, not threatening exactly, but making her position clear. The community of Harlan County in 1947 was insular and protective of its own, built on generations of families who had worked the land and the mines and who understood that life in the mountains was hard enough without outside interference. People minded their own business as a matter of survival and respect, knowing that every family had struggles and that judgment came too easily when you didn't know the full story. But the whispers about Margaret Hale grew louder as autumn progressed into winter, fed by glimpses of bruises on Dorothy's arms, by the way James would sometimes appear at a neighbor's house begging for food, claiming his mother had forgotten to feed him, and by the sounds that occasionally drifted down from the stone house on particularly still nights, sounds that might have been screaming or might have been the wind howling through the bare trees. Sarah McKinney, who lived closest to the Hales, about a mile down the hollow, was the first to voice her concerns openly. She was a woman in her 50s, widowed herself when her husband died in a mine collapse in 1943, and she had known Margaret since they were both young women attending the same church. Sarah remembered Margaret as a quiet girl, dutiful and hardworking, who had seemed neither particularly happy nor unhappy in her marriage to Thomas. After Thomas died, Sarah had brought casseroles and offered help, but Margaret had accepted the food with barely a word of thanks and made it clear that her presence was not welcome beyond the front porch. Sarah had noticed the changes in Dorothy and James with growing alarm, and by November, she felt compelled to speak with Reverend Coleman at the Baptist Church. Reverend Coleman was a man of 62 who had served the Harlan County community for 30 years, baptizing babies and burying the dead and counseling families through the hardships that defined mountain life. He listened to Sarah's concerns with the gravity they deserved, his weathered face creasing further with worry as she described what she had observed. He promised to visit the Hale household and assess the situation personally, though he warned Sarah that without clear evidence of wrongdoing, there was little the community could do beyond offering support and prayers. The visit was scheduled for a cold Tuesday in late November, when the first snow of the season had begun to dust the peaks of the mountains and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. Margaret received Reverend Coleman with the same cold courtesy she showed everyone, inviting him into the front room where a wood stove provided barely adequate heat against the drafty walls. The room was Spartan and clean, furnished with a worn sofa, 2 straight-backed chairs, and a small table that held a Bible and a kerosene lamp. Dorothy was in the kitchen, visible through the doorway, washing dishes in silence, and James sat on the floor in the corner, playing with carved wooden figures that might have been animals or might have been something else entirely. Reverend Coleman made small talk about the weather and the upcoming Christmas season, trying to establish a comfortable rapport, but Margaret's responses were brief and her expression remained neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile but utterly closed. When Reverend Coleman gently inquired about how Dorothy and James were managing after losing their father, Margaret's pale eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She stated that the children were fine, that they were learning important lessons about responsibility and self-reliance, and that the loss of Thomas, while tragic, had freed the household from certain burdens. The Reverend found her choice of words strange, the reference to burdens particularly troubling, but when he asked what she meant, Margaret simply said that a man's presence wasn't always the blessing people assumed it to be. She offered no further explanation, and when Reverend Coleman asked to speak with Dorothy and James separately, Margaret refused, stating that anything he needed to know he could learn from her directly. The visit lasted less than 30 minutes, ending when Margaret stood abruptly and thanked the Reverend for his concern but made it clear that his presence was no longer required. As Reverend Coleman walked back to his truck, he glanced back at the stone house and saw Dorothy watching from an upstairs window, her face pale against the glass, her expression one of such desperate sadness that it haunted him for days afterward. He drove back down the mountain troubled and uncertain, knowing that something was deeply wrong in the Hale household but lacking any concrete evidence that would justify intervention. In the hierarchical structure of 1940s rural Appalachia, a mother's authority over her children was nearly absolute, particularly when there was no father present, and absent clear proof of severe abuse, even a concerned reverend had limited power to act. The winter of 1947 was particularly harsh, with heavy snows that blocked the mountain roads for weeks at a time and temperatures that plunged below zero on the clearest nights. The stone house on Bitter Creek became even more isolated, accessible only by foot through deep drifts that made the 3-mile trek from the main road an arduous journey. Margaret made occasional trips to town for supplies, walking the distance with a determined stride that suggested she felt no cold, while Dorothy and James remained at the house, their presence known only through the thin smoke that rose from the chimney and the occasional glimpse of a face at a window. It was during this winter that the true nature of Margaret Hale's cruelty began to emerge, though the full story would not be known for many months. The isolation of the season provided perfect cover for actions that would shock the community and challenge their understanding of maternal love and human capacity for harm. Inside the stone house, where the walls were thick and the windows small, where the wind screamed through the trees and the snow piled high against the doors, a different kind of storm was raging, one that would leave scars far deeper than any winter could inflict. The methods Margaret Hale employed to control her children were systematic and calculated, developed over years of marriage to a man whose own temper had been legendary in the mining camps. Thomas Hale had been a drinker who came home angry more often than not, and Margaret had learned early in their marriage that survival meant understanding power and how to wield it. She had endured his rages with stoic silence, cleaning up broken dishes and hiding bruises beneath long sleeves, and she had watched carefully, learning the mechanics of dominance and submission. When Thomas died, whether by genuine accident or something more deliberate, Margaret found herself in possession of the authority she had always lacked, and she exercised it with a fervor that suggested years of suppressed rage finally finding expression. The discipline began with small deprivations. Dorothy and James were required to earn their meals through labor, and Margaret set standards that were nearly impossible to meet. The house had to be cleaned to perfection, every surface scrubbed, every corner swept, every dish washed and dried and put away exactly in its designated place. The firewood had to be split and stacked with precision, the ashes from the stove disposed of properly, the outhouse maintained, the chickens fed and their eggs collected without breaking a single shell. Any failure, no matter how minor, resulted in punishment, and Margaret's punishments were creative in their cruelty. When Dorothy failed to clean the windows to Margaret's satisfaction, leaving faint streaks visible in the morning light, she was denied food for 2 days. When James accidentally let the fire in the stove go out during the night, requiring Margaret to restart it in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, he was locked in the root cellar beneath the kitchen for 6 hours, in total darkness, with only the sounds of rats and his own frightened breathing for company. The root cellar was Margaret's favorite punishment tool, a stone-lined space barely 5 feet high and 8 feet square, accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. It was cold and damp and utterly black when the door was closed, and the psychological terror it induced was far more effective than any physical beating. Margaret justified her actions to herself with a twisted logic that had calcified over years of hardship. She believed that softness and mercy were luxuries that mountain life could not afford, that children needed to be hardened like steel through fire and pressure, and that the world beyond Bitter Creek would show them no kindness, so neither would she. She convinced herself that she was preparing Dorothy and James for reality, teaching them self-sufficiency and resilience, though the truth was darker and more personal. Margaret was exercising the power she had never possessed, inflicting on her children the control and domination that had been inflicted on her, completing a cycle of abuse that she refused to recognize or break. Dorothy, at 15, bore the brunt of Margaret's cruelty. As the older child and the only daughter still at home, she was expected to function as a second mother, a housekeeper, and a surrogate for Margaret's accumulated resentments. Margaret seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault with Dorothy's appearance, her mannerisms, her voice, anything that reminded Margaret of her own lost youth or unfulfilled dreams. She would criticize Dorothy's posture, calling her slouched and lazy, then punish her by making her stand for hours with books balanced on her head. She would mock Dorothy's attempts to maintain some small vanity, cutting the girl's hair brutally short when she found her trying to braid it prettily, then telling her she looked like a boy and no man would ever want her. The physical abuse was regular but calculated to leave minimal visible marks. Margaret used switches cut from the willow trees near the creek, whipping Dorothy's back and legs where clothing would hide the welts. She used her hands to slap and pinch, targeting areas that bruised less obviously. She withheld food until Dorothy's ribs began to show through her thin dresses, then fed her just enough to maintain function but not comfort. The psychological torment was even more sophisticated. Margaret would alternate between cold indifference and sudden rages, creating an environment of constant anxiety where Dorothy never knew what might trigger punishment. She would make promises of kindness or reward, then break them arbitrarily, teaching Dorothy that hope itself was dangerous and trust was foolish. James, at 8 years old, suffered differently but no less severely. Margaret treated him with a coldness that suggested she viewed him as an unwanted burden, a reminder of obligations she resented. She spoke to him rarely, and when she did, her words were harsh and dismissive. She called him stupid, lazy, worthless, a waste of food and air. She compared him unfavorably to his older brother Samuel, claiming that James would never amount to anything, that he was weak like his father, that she should have left him at an orphanage when Thomas died. The verbal abuse was relentless and designed to destroy the boy's sense of self-worth before it could fully form. James's physical punishments were different from Dorothy's, tailored to his smaller size and younger age. Margaret would lock him outside in the cold for hours, regardless of weather, telling him he could come in when he learned to stop crying or complaining. She would make him kneel on dried corn kernels in the corner, a punishment that caused intense pain in his small knees but left no lasting marks. She restricted his portions at meals to barely enough for survival, and on days when he displeased her, she gave him nothing but water. The root cellar remained her primary tool for serious infractions, and James's terror of that dark space became so intense that the mere threat of it could reduce him to trembling obedience. The isolation of winter meant that Dorothy and James had no escape and no witnesses to their suffering. The stone walls of the house absorbed their cries, and the howling wind masked any sounds that might have carried to Sarah McKinney's place down the hollow. Margaret maintained a careful facade during her infrequent trips to town, presenting herself as a struggling widow managing as best she could, and the few people who saw Dorothy or James saw only quiet, obedient children who had learned not to speak out of turn. The bruises and welts were hidden beneath layers of clothing appropriate for the season, and the weight loss could be attributed to the general hardship of mountain poverty. By February of 1948, the situation in the stone house had deteriorated to a point that would have horrified any outside observer, though no outside observers were permitted. Dorothy had developed a hollow-eyed exhaustion that made her appear years older than 15, and her hands shook constantly from a combination of malnutrition and chronic stress. James had regressed in his behavior, wetting his bed regularly despite being long past the age for such accidents, which only earned him more punishment. Both children moved through their days in a state of numb compliance, their spirits ground down by months of systematic cruelty that had become their complete reality. Margaret herself seemed energized by the control she wielded, as though the suffering of her children fed something hungry and cold in her soul. She slept soundly at night, unbothered by conscience or doubt, and she planned her punishments with the same methodical attention she gave to household management. She kept a small notebook hidden in her bedroom where she recorded infractions and assigned appropriate responses, a ledger of cruelty that demonstrated the calculated nature of her abuse. The notebook detailed dates, offenses, and punishments delivered, written in a neat, careful hand that suggested pride in her systematic approach. The community's suspicions continued to grow, fed by Sarah McKinney's persistent concerns and the observations of others who had brief encounters with the Hale family. The schoolteacher noted James's frequent absences and his withdrawn behavior on the rare occasions he attended. The store owner noticed Dorothy's trembling hands and the way she flinched at sudden movements. Reverend Coleman received additional reports from parishioners who had seen or heard things that troubled them, and he struggled with the question of when concern became obligation to act. The cultural norms of the time and place made intervention difficult, but the accumulating evidence suggested something far darker than normal parental strictness. In March, as the snow began to melt and the roads became passable again, an event occurred that would finally catalyze action. James, desperate and starving after 3 days of being denied food for the offense of breaking a plate, ran away from the stone house in the middle of the night. He stumbled through the darkness, barefoot and wearing only thin pajamas, and made it nearly 2 miles before collapsing from exhaustion and hypothermia on Sarah McKinney's front porch. Sarah found him at dawn, barely conscious and shaking violently, his feet bleeding and his lips blue. She carried him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him warm broth while he cried and told her fragmented stories of the root cellar, the beatings, the starvation, and his mother's cold, pale eyes that seemed to hold nothing but contempt. Sarah McKinney's discovery of James Hale collapsed on her porch at dawn created the crisis that the community had been moving toward for months. She immediately wrapped the boy in every blanket she owned, her weathered hands shaking as she felt how thin he had become, each rib countable beneath skin that stretched too tight. His feet were torn and bleeding from running barefoot over frozen ground, and when she tried to warm them, he whimpered in pain. She fed him slowly, knowing that a starving child cannot take food too quickly without becoming sick, and as the warmth and safety of her small cabin began to penetrate his terror, James started to speak in broken sentences about what life had been like in the stone house on Bitter Creek. The stories James told were worse than Sarah had imagined in her darkest concerns. He described days spent locked in the root cellar with no light and no sense of time passing, where the rats would sometimes run across his legs and he would scream until his voice was gone. He talked about being forced to stand outside in winter storms until his fingers went numb and his teeth chattered so hard he thought they would break. He showed her scars on his back from willow switches, old marks that had healed into pale lines crisscrossing his small shoulder blades. He told her about watching his sister Dorothy being beaten, and how Margaret would sometimes make him watch as punishment for them both, teaching him that caring about someone meant watching them suffer. Most disturbing were James's descriptions of Margaret's complete emotional coldness, the way she administered punishment without anger or passion, as though she were performing necessary chores. He said his mother's face never changed, that she looked the same whether she was serving dinner or locking him in the cellar, and that this emptiness frightened him more than anything else. He told Sarah that he sometimes wondered if his mother was real or if she was some kind of creature that only looked like a person, a comment that revealed how profoundly her abuse had damaged his understanding of human nature and maternal love. Sarah listened to all of this with tears running down her face, though she tried to remain calm for James's sake. When he finally fell asleep, exhausted from his escape and the trauma of recounting his experiences, she covered him carefully and then walked to her own small kitchen table to think about what must be done. The cultural norms of Harlan County in 1948 were clear about family privacy and maternal authority, but they were equally clear about the community's responsibility to protect its children when parents failed in their most basic duties. Sarah knew that bringing official attention to the Hale situation would create scandal and judgment, that it would mark Dorothy and James forever in the eyes of their neighbors, but she also knew that silence had already permitted too much harm. She waited until mid-morning, when she was certain James was resting comfortably, then walked the 3 miles to Reverend Coleman's home near the church. The March morning was cold but clear, with the last patches of winter's snow melting into muddy streams that ran alongside the road. She found the Reverend working in his small garden, preparing the soil for spring planting, and she told him everything James had revealed. Reverend Coleman listened with an expression of deep sorrow, nodding occasionally but saying nothing until Sarah had finished her account. Then he stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and told her that they needed to involve the county sheriff, that this had moved beyond the realm of pastoral counseling into criminal territory. Sheriff Ben Tucker was a man of 50 who had held his position for 12 years, elected on his reputation for fairness and his deep roots in the county. He was a cousin to half the families in Harlan and had known Thomas Hale from the mining camps, which gave him personal context for the situation but also complicated his objectivity. When Reverend Coleman and Sarah McKinney arrived at his small office in town and laid out their concerns, backed by James's testimony and Sarah's own observations, Tucker's weathered face hardened with a mixture of anger and resignation. He had heard the rumors about Margaret Hale but had dismissed them as gossip, unwilling to believe that a mother could be so systematically cruel to her own children. The sheriff organized a visit to the stone house that afternoon, bringing along his deputy, a young man named Miller who was eager and earnest but largely untested. Reverend Coleman accompanied them, and Sarah McKinney insisted on coming as well, determined to see the situation through now that it had reached this point. They drove as far as the road permitted, then walked the final mile to the Hale property, their boots squelching through mud and their breath misting in the cool air. The stone house appeared even more forbidding in daylight, its narrow windows like dark eyes watching their approach, and the yard was littered with debris and neglect that suggested the decay of more than just property. Margaret met them on the porch, and the confrontation that followed was tense and strange in its civility. Sheriff Tucker explained that they had received reports of child mistreatment and were there to investigate and ensure the welfare of Dorothy and James. Margaret listened without visible emotion, her pale eyes moving from face to face, and then she stated calmly that James had run away because he was disobedient and ungrateful, that he was a liar and a troublemaker, and that whatever he had told them was fabrication designed to cause problems. When Tucker asked to see Dorothy and to inspect the house, Margaret initially refused, citing her rights as a property owner and a parent, but Tucker informed her that he could return with a legal warrant if necessary, and that cooperation now would be better for everyone involved. Dorothy was found upstairs in a small bedroom that was bare except for a thin mattress on the floor and a single blanket. She was wearing a dress that hung loosely on her gaunt frame, and when she saw the group of adults enter her room, her immediate reaction was fear, her eyes darting to Margaret as though seeking permission to speak or move. Reverend Coleman approached her gently, asking how she was doing, and Dorothy's response was barely audible, a whispered claim that she was fine, that everything was fine, that James was lying and she didn't know why he would say such things. But her body told a different story. The bruises on her arms were visible even in the dim light, and when Sarah McKinney gently touched her shoulder, Dorothy flinched so violently that she stumbled backward. The inspection of the house revealed conditions that shocked even Sheriff Tucker, who had seen poverty and hardship throughout his career. The root cellar beneath the kitchen was exactly as James had described, a cold stone space with scratch marks on the walls where desperate hands had clawed at unyielding rock. The kitchen itself was spotlessly clean but nearly empty of food, with only basic staples in quantities that suggested severe rationing. Dorothy and James's bedroom was stark and cheerless, while Margaret's room, though modest, contained personal items and comforts that had been denied to the children. Most damning was the notebook that Deputy Miller found in Margaret's dresser, the careful record of infractions and punishments that documented her systematic approach to abuse. Margaret maintained her cold composure throughout the inspection, insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that she was teaching her children discipline and self-reliance, that the world was hard and they needed to learn how to survive without coddling or weakness. She claimed that Thomas had been too soft, that his drinking and temper had actually masked an underlying sentimentality that had made the children lazy and entitled, and that she was correcting years of poor parenting. When Sheriff Tucker told her that he was taking Dorothy into protective custody and that James would remain with Sarah McKinney for the time being, Margaret's expression finally changed, a flash of genuine anger crossing her features before the mask of control returned. The legal process that followed Margaret Hale's confrontation with law enforcement was complicated by the era's limited understanding of child abuse and the cultural factors that made such cases difficult to prosecute. In 1948, parental rights were considered nearly absolute, and the standard for state intervention was extraordinarily high. Physical discipline of children was not only legal but socially encouraged, and the line between acceptable punishment and criminal abuse was vague and subjectively determined. Margaret's defense attorney, a man named Carlisle from Lexington who took the case for reasons that probably involved publicity more than justice, argued that his client was a widow struggling to raise children alone in poverty, that she had used traditional mountain discipline methods, and that the accusations against her reflected a misunderstanding of Appalachian culture. The county prosecutor, however, was a woman named Elizabeth Warren, a rare female attorney in that time and place, who had built her career on advocating for the vulnerable. She was in her 40s, sharp-minded and relentless, and she viewed the Hale case as emblematic of broader issues around children's rights and maternal accountability. Warren interviewed Dorothy and James extensively, documenting their testimony with a thoroughness that was unusual for the time. She consulted with a doctor from Lexington who examined both children and provided medical evidence of malnutrition, healed fractures, and scarring consistent with repeated physical abuse. She built a case that went beyond simple corporal punishment to demonstrate systematic cruelty and deliberate infliction of suffering. The trial began in late April of 1948, held in the Harlan County Courthouse, a brick building that served as the center of legal authority for the region. The courtroom was packed with community members, some supporting Margaret as a widow being persecuted for trying to maintain order, others horrified by the evidence that emerged during testimony. Dorothy and James both testified, though their accounts were difficult to hear and even more difficult for them to deliver. Dorothy spoke in a flat, emotionless voice that suggested deep trauma, describing years of abuse that had begun long before Thomas died but had intensified afterward. James, still only 8, struggled to articulate his experiences, but his physical condition and his obvious fear spoke volumes that words could not capture. The defense attempted to discredit the children's testimony, suggesting they had been coached or were exaggerating normal discipline, but Elizabeth Warren systematically dismantled these arguments with medical evidence and expert testimony. The notebook found in Margaret's dresser was particularly damning, as it demonstrated premeditation and awareness that contradicted any claim of acting in the heat of frustration or stress. The entries were detailed and systematic, recording not just punishments but also Margaret's reasoning, and the cold, clinical tone of the writing revealed a mind that viewed cruelty as methodology rather than emotional reaction. Margaret herself testified in her own defense, and her testimony was remarkable for its complete lack of remorse or self-awareness. She maintained that everything she had done was necessary and appropriate, that she had been preparing her children for a harsh world, and that soft modern notions about child-rearing were inappropriate for mountain life. She showed no emotion when confronted with photographs of her children's injuries, no recognition of wrongdoing when her notebook entries were read aloud. Her flat affect and absolute conviction in her own righteousness created an impression that disturbed even those inclined to sympathize with her situation. Several jury members later reported that listening to Margaret's testimony made them realize they were dealing with someone whose capacity for empathy had been fundamentally damaged or destroyed. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict on multiple counts of child abuse and cruelty. Margaret Hale showed no reaction when the verdict was read, sitting with the same rigid posture and blank expression she had maintained throughout the trial. Judge Raymond Harris, who had presided over Harlan County Court for 20 years and had seen the full spectrum of human behavior, delivered a sentence that was severe by the standards of the time. Margaret was sentenced to 15 years in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, with a recommendation that she receive psychiatric evaluation and treatment. Harris stated in his sentencing remarks that while he understood the hardships of mountain life and the challenges of widowhood, nothing justified the systematic torture of innocent children, and that Margaret Hale represented a danger not just to her own family but to fundamental human decency. The community's reaction to the verdict and sentence was mixed and complex, revealing the tensions between traditional values and emerging awareness of children's rights. Some neighbors, particularly older residents who had been raised with harsh physical discipline, felt that Margaret was being punished for methods that were common in their generation. They worried about the precedent of state intervention in family matters and the erosion of parental authority. Others, especially younger parents and those who had witnessed the condition of Dorothy and James, felt that justice had finally been served and that the verdict represented necessary progress in protecting the vulnerable. The case became a topic of discussion throughout eastern Kentucky, referenced in sermons and debated in general stores, and it contributed to slowly changing attitudes about what constituted acceptable treatment of children. Margaret was transported to the penitentiary in late May of 1948, and she would serve 11 years of her sentence before being released on parole in 1959. Prison records from her incarceration reveal a woman who remained largely unchanged by her punishment. She was a model prisoner in terms of following rules and maintaining order, but psychological evaluations noted her continued lack of empathy and her inability to recognize her actions as wrong. She participated in required programs but showed no genuine engagement with rehabilitation concepts. Letters she wrote to various authorities during her imprisonment continued to assert that she had been unjustly convicted, that her children had betrayed her, and that society had failed to understand the necessities of proper discipline. She never expressed remorse, never asked about Dorothy or James, and never acknowledged any responsibility for the harm she had caused. Dorothy and James were placed in foster care initially, then later adopted by separate families who offered them the stability and kindness they had been denied. The adjustment was difficult for both children, as the trauma they had experienced created lasting psychological damage that would take years to address. Dorothy, in particular, struggled with depression and anxiety, finding it difficult to trust adults or accept affection without suspicion. She underwent therapy with one of the few child psychologists practicing in Kentucky at the time, a progressive doctor named Sullivan who specialized in trauma recovery. The process was slow and painful, requiring Dorothy to confront memories she had buried deep and to relearn basic concepts about safety and love. James's recovery followed a different trajectory, complicated by his younger age and the developmental impact of his abuse. He had nightmares about the root cellar for years, and he developed a profound fear of enclosed spaces that persisted into adulthood. His adoptive family, a couple named Henderson who had no biological children, provided patient and consistent care that gradually helped him understand that not all adults were threats and that his basic needs would be met without requiring perfection. He returned to school but struggled academically, his early educational neglect and trauma-related concentration issues creating challenges that required special intervention and support. Both children eventually learned that their older brother Samuel had been killed in a mining accident in Virginia in 1949, news that reached them through their respective adoptive families. Samuel had testified at his mother's trial, revealing that he too had experienced abuse growing up, though he had escaped the worst of it by leaving for work in the mines at a young age. His death added another layer of tragedy to the Hale family story, suggesting that the damage Margaret had inflicted extended beyond the two youngest children to affect the entire family structure. Rebecca, the eldest daughter, refused all contact with Dorothy and James after the trial, whether from shame, denial, or her own unprocessed trauma. She never spoke publicly about her mother or her childhood, taking whatever secrets she held to her grave. When she died in 1973, the stone house on Bitter Creek remained empty for several years after Margaret's imprisonment, gradually falling into disrepair as weather and neglect took their toll. Local teenagers sometimes dared each other to approach the property, creating ghost stories about the place that transformed actual human cruelty into supernatural mythology. Eventually, in 1955, the property was sold for unpaid taxes to a family from out of state who knew nothing of its history. They demolished the stone house and built a new structure, perhaps sensing something unwelcoming in the original building or simply finding it too damaged to restore. The root cellar was filled in with rubble and soil, erasing the physical evidence of one of the spaces where Margaret's cruelty had been most concentrated. Sarah McKinney remained connected to James throughout his childhood and adolescence, serving as a grandmother figure who provided continuity and a living link to his past. She was careful in how she spoke about Margaret, neither defending the indefensible nor encouraging hatred, but rather helping James understand that his mother had been damaged in ways that made her incapable of love. Sarah shared stories about Margaret's own difficult childhood, about the harshness of her parents and the violence of her marriage to Thomas, not to excuse Margaret's actions but to provide context that might help James make sense of incomprehensible cruelty. This nuanced approach to understanding the cycle of abuse helped James develop a more complex view of human behavior than simple categories of good and evil could provide. As the years passed and the immediate trauma of the case faded from community memory, the story of Margaret Hale became a cautionary tale told in different ways by different people. Some used it to argue for better support systems for widows and single mothers, noting that Margaret's isolation and lack of resources had contributed to her breakdown. Others focused on the importance of community vigilance and the responsibility to intervene when children were at risk, citing the months of ignored warning signs that had preceded James's desperate escape. Still others examined it through the lens of generational trauma, recognizing that Margaret herself had been a victim before becoming a perpetrator, though this recognition did not diminish her accountability for her choices. Dorothy Hale, who eventually took her adoptive family's name and became Dorothy Mitchell, went on to become a social worker specializing in child welfare. She married in her late 20s to a kind man who respected her need for patience and understanding as she continued to work through her past. She had 2 children of her own, and by all accounts, she was a loving and attentive mother, determined to break the cycle that had nearly destroyed her. She rarely spoke publicly about her childhood, protecting her privacy and her family from the weight of her history, but she quietly advocated for stronger child protection laws and better training for those who worked with abused children. Her professional choices reflected a transformation of her suffering into purpose, though those who knew her well said that the sadness never fully left her eyes. James Hale, who kept his birth name, became a schoolteacher working with elementary-age children in a small town in Tennessee. His own experiences gave him particular sensitivity to signs of trouble in his students, and he intervened more than once to help children who were living in difficult situations. He never married, finding it difficult to form the kind of intimate trust that marriage required, but he built a life of quiet service and found meaning in helping others. He maintained occasional contact with Dorothy, their shared history creating a bond that neither time nor distance could break, though their conversations rarely touched directly on their mother or the stone house on Bitter Creek. Margaret Hale was released from prison in 1959 at the age of 52, paroled for good behavior despite the concerns of prison psychologists who believed she remained fundamentally unchanged. She moved to a small town in southern Illinois, far from Kentucky and anyone who knew her history, and lived out her remaining years working as a cleaning woman in a hotel. She made no attempt to contact Dorothy or James, and they made no attempt to find her. She lived alone in a rented room, maintaining the same rigid order and cleanliness that had characterized her earlier life, her days structured around work and solitude. She attended no church, made no friends, and kept entirely to herself, a figure of almost ghostly isolation. She died in 1967 at the age of 60, found in her room by the hotel manager when she failed to appear for work. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack, quick and relatively painless, a mercy that many felt she had not earned. There was no funeral service, no obituary beyond a bare notice in the local paper, and she was buried in a pauper's section of the municipal cemetery under a small marker that listed only her name and dates. Neither Dorothy nor James was notified of her death until months later, and neither expressed any desire to visit her grave or mark her passing in any way. For them, Margaret had died years earlier, in the moment when they finally escaped her control and began the long process of healing. The case of Margaret Hale never achieved widespread notoriety beyond eastern Kentucky, occurring in an era before mass media and true crime fascination would have amplified such stories. It was documented in local court records and occasionally referenced in legal discussions about child welfare, but it remained largely obscure, one of countless family tragedies that occurred in isolated communities across America in the mid-20th century. The fact that the abuser was a mother rather than a father made the case particularly troubling to a society that had deeply ingrained notions about maternal instinct and women's natural nurturing capacity. Margaret's cruelty challenged comfortable assumptions about gender and family, revealing that the capacity for systematic harm knew no boundaries of sex or relation. In the decades that followed, as understanding of child abuse and trauma expanded through research and advocacy, the Hale case could be analyzed through frameworks that did not exist in 1948. Margaret's behavior showed clear signs of antisocial personality disorder, characterized by lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional connections, and view of others as objects to be controlled rather than people to be respected. Her own history of abuse and her marriage to a violent man had likely either created or exacerbated these traits, though whether she was born with these tendencies or whether they developed in response to trauma remains unknowable. What is clear is that she represented the endpoint of a cycle that had operated for generations, and that her children's survival and eventual ability to live productive lives represented a breaking of that cycle, achieved at tremendous personal cost. The stone house on Bitter Creek exists now only in the memories of those old enough to remember the original structure, and in the occasional mention in local history books that chronicle the region's more troubling episodes. The new house that replaced it has sheltered several families over the decades, none of whom reported any lingering sense of unease or awareness of the property's dark history. The creek still runs cold and clear over ancient rock, and the mountains still hold their secrets close, but the particular horror that Margaret Hale created has faded into the past, remembered by fewer people with each passing year. What remains is the lesson that cruelty is not limited by gender, that authority without love becomes tyranny, and that children's vulnerability requires vigilant protection from those who would exploit it. Margaret Hale was too cruel for the history books not because her cruelty exceeded documentation, but because her story challenged narratives that society preferred to maintain about mothers and families. Her case forced uncomfortable recognition that evil could wear a familiar face, that homes could become prisons, and that the people tasked with protecting children could become their most dangerous threat. In this sense, her story remains relevant, a reminder that awareness and intervention are moral obligations that transcend discomfort and cultural norms about privacy and parental rights. Dorothy and James lived long lives marked by both the shadows of their past and the light they managed to create despite it. They became testaments to resilience and the human capacity to heal from even the most profound wounds. Their mother's name is largely forgotten, as it should be, while their survival and recovery stand as the true story worth remembering. The secret case of Margaret Hale is secret no longer, preserved in court documents and the memories of aging witnesses, a cautionary tale from the Appalachian Mountains about the cost of unchecked cruelty and the imperative to protect the vulnerable, regardless of who threatens them or how uncomfortable that protection might be. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel, Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.